photon depended on its wavelength, or as we would perceive it, its colour. Understanding the structure of atoms could now also explain nature's great electrical light shows. Just like Geissler's tubes, the type of gas the electricity passes through defines its colour. Lightning has a blue tinge because of the nitrogen in our atmosphere. Higher in the atmosphere, the gases are different, and so is the colour of the photons they produce, creating the spectacular auroras. Understanding atoms, how they fit together in materials and how their electrons behave, was the final key to understanding the fundamental nature of electricity. This is a Wimshurst machine, and it's used to generate electric charge. Electrons are rubbed off these discs and start a flow of electricity through the metal arms of the machine. Now, metals conduct electricity because the electrons are very weakly bound inside their atoms and so can slosh about and be used to flow as electricity. Insulators, on the other hand, don't conduct electricity because the electrons are very tightly bound inside the atoms and are not free to move about. The flow of electrons, and hence electricity, through materials was now understood. Conductors and insulators could be explained. What was more difficult to understand was the strange properties of semiconductors. Our modern electronic world is built upon semiconductors and would grind to a halt without them. Jagadish Chandra Bose may have stumbled upon their properties back in the 1890s, but no one could have foreseen just how important they were to become. But with the outbreak of the Second World War, things were about to change. Here in Oxford, this newly built physics laboratory was immediately handed over to the war research effort. The researchers here were tasked with improving the British radar system. Radar was a technology that used electromagnetic waves to detect enemy bombers. And as its accuracy improved, it became clear that valves just weren't up to the job. So the team had to turn to old technology. Instead of valves, they used semiconductor crystals. Now, they didn't use the same sort of crystals that Bose had developed. Instead, they used silicon. This device is the silicon crystal receiver. There's a tiny tungsten wire coiled down and touching the surface of a little silicon crystal. It's incredible how important a device it was. It was the first time silicon had really been exploited as a semiconductor. But for it to work, it needed to be very pure. And both sides in the war put a lot of resources into purifying it.
In fact, the British had better silicon devices. So they must have had some growth of silicon already at that time, which we were just starting with, in Berlin.
The British had better silicon semiconductors because they had help from laboratories in the US, in particular the famous Bell Labs. And it wasn't long before physicists realized that if semiconductors could replace valves in radar, perhaps they could replace valves in other devices too, like amplifiers. The simple vacuum tube with its one-way stream of electrons had been modified to produce a new device. By placing a metal grill in the path of the electrons and applying a tiny voltage to it, a dramatic change in the strength of the beam could be produced. These valves worked as amplifiers. turning a very weak electrical signal into a much stronger one.
An amplifier is something, in one sense, really simple. You just take a small current, you turn it into a larger current. But in other ways, it changes the world, because when you can amplify a signal, you can send it anywhere in the world.
As soon as the war was over, German expert Herbert Maturay and his colleague Heinrich Welcker started to build a semiconductor device that could be used as an electrical amplifier. And here is that first working model that Maturay and Welcker made. If you look inside, you can see the tiny crystal and the wires that make contact with it. If you pass a small current through one of the wires, this allows a much larger current to flow through the other one. So it was acting as a signal amplifier. These tiny devices could replace big, expensive valves in long-distance telephone networks, radios, and other equipment where a faint signal needed boosting. Maturay immediately realized what he'd created, but his bosses were initially not interested. Not, that is, until a paper appeared in a journal announcing a Bell Labs discovery. A research team there had stumbled across the same effect, and now they were announcing their invention to the world. They called it the transistor.
They had it in December 1947, and we had it in beginning 48, but just life, you know. They had it a little bit earlier, the effect. But funny enough, their transistors were just no good.
Although the European device was more reliable than Bell Labs' more experimental model, neither quite fulfilled their promise. They worked, but were just too delicate. So the search was on for a more robust way to amplify electrical signals. And the breakthrough came by accident. In Bell Labs, silicon crystal expert Russell Ohl noticed that one of his silicon ingots had a really bizarre property. It seemed to be able to generate its own voltage. And when he tried to measure this by hooking it up to an oscilloscope, he noticed that the voltage changed all the time. The amount of voltage it generated seemed to depend on how much light there was in the room. So by casting a shadow over the crystal, he saw the voltage dropped. More light meant the voltage went up. What's more, when he turned a fan on between the lamp and the crystal, the voltage started to oscillate with the same frequency that the blades of the fan were casting shadows over the crystal. One of Ohl's colleagues immediately realized that the ingot had a crack in it that formed a natural junction. And this tiny natural junction